You know, when you hear an ancient story about a golden calf, you might think, what does that have to do with me today? Well, according to Imam Ahmed al-Hassan's book, The Calf, it has everything to do with us. He argues this isn't just some old story. Nope. He says it's a pattern, one that's repeating itself right now and reveals a really deep crisis that believers are facing in our modern world. So let's dive in and unpack the core argument of his book.
So the author kicks things off by diagnosing a huge problem. He says that so many believers today feel like they're caught in a trap, just completely powerless and stagnant. He has this phrase for it. He says they're stuck between the Pharaoh and Samaritan. And these two figures, they are absolutely central to his entire argument. They're the ones he says are at the very root of the crisis.
Okay, so the big question is, who are this Pharaoh and the Samaritan? Well, the entire book is basically built around these two archetypes. And here's the kicker. The author's point is that these aren't just characters from some old story. He sees them as timeless forces of corruption, forces that are, believe it or not, very much alive and well today. All right, so let's break down how the author sees these two forces. First step, you've got the Pharaoh. Think of the Pharaoh as the external, obvious bad guy, the oppressive political tyrant who uses brute force to get what he wants. And the author points to what he calls the American tyrant as a modern-day example. But then, and this is crucial, you have the Samaritan. This figure is the internal threat. This isn't an outsider. This is a knowledgeable religious scholar who messes things up from the inside, often by convincing people to just submit to those very same tyrants. So, to really show how these two forces, the external and the internal, work together, the author takes us right back to that foundational story, the one that gives the book its name, The Trial of the Golden Calf. And for him, this isn't just a simple story about idolatry. No, he sees it as the original blueprint, the first time this crisis of leadership and faith really played out. The story, as the author lays it out, pretty much happens in 3 steps. First, the real leader, Moses, is gone. He's up on Mount Sinai for 40 days, so he's not around. Second, with Moses gone, there's a power vacuum. And this guy, the Samaritan, who's from inside the community, remember, he steps in. He makes a golden calf out of people's jewelry and says, hey, here's your new God. And third, the people, well, they fall for it. Even though Moses' successor, Aaron, warns them, they betray their faith and start worshiping this thing.
And this leads to a really, really important question. I mean, usually we think of a deceiver as some obvious outsider, right? But the author's take on who the Samari was, it's a lot more chilling than that. So, who exactly was this guy?
Well, according to the book, the Samaritan wasn't some clueless outsider. Not at all. He was a knowledgeable insider. I mean, this was a guy who could see things other people couldn't. So what was his problem? Well, it all came down to arrogance and envy. He was jealous of Moses and Aaron's leadership, so he used his special knowledge to rebel against them. He created a new thing to worship so he could grab that spiritual authority for himself. And this is the point the author drives home. The greatest threat, it came from within. And right here, this is where the author's main idea really comes into focus. He's basically saying that the story of the calf, it wasn't a one-time thing, not even close. He argues it's a pattern, a dynamic that has played out over and over and over again throughout history. Different names, different faces, but always the same essential characters. The book frames this as a timeless struggle, really. The idea is that in every single era, a divine guide shows up, but every time they're opposed by the same two forces. You have the external tyrant, that's the Pharaoh, and you have the internal corrupt scholar, that's the Samaritan. The author is saying that if you want to understand religious history, this is the dynamic you need to get. Let's make this super clear with an example. So in Moses' time, right, you have Moses the prophet, Pharaoh the tyrant, and the Samari as the corrupt insider. Okay? Now, the author draws a straight line from that to the time of Jesus. In that story, Jesus is the prophet, the Roman ruler Pilate is the tyrant, and the Samari role, well, that's played by the corrupt scribes and Pharisees, what the book calls the non-working scholars of that time. And to really hammer this point home, the author brings in the words of Jesus himself, confronting those exact religious authorities. He quotes from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus literally calls them hypocrites, saying they pretend to hold the keys to heaven, but they're actually blocking the door so nobody can get in. For the author, this is a perfect echo of what the Samaritans did. Okay, so after laying out this whole pattern throughout history, the book makes a really big pivot. It moves from the past to the future. The argument becomes that this whole drama, this repeating cycle, it's all building up to one final, epic, prophesied confrontation.
And at the heart of this prophecy is a concept called the appointed time. So, what is that? The book defines it as the prophesied day of the rising of the awaited Imam al-Mahdi. This, according to the author, is the moment when this entire historical pattern we've been talking about finally hits its climax.
And here's the warning from the book. When this time comes, the path for the awaited Mahdi isn't going to be clear. Not at all. Prophecy says he's going to face the exact same two enemies. There'll be modern-day pharaohs, tyrants with their armies, and then, maybe even more dangerously, there will be modern-day Samaritans. The author calls them appalling, non-working scholars who will fight him from right inside the faith itself.
So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? What are we supposed to do with this? Well, the author wraps it all up by bringing the lesson from that ancient story right into our world today, framing it as a really urgent warning for believers.
When you boil it all down, the story of the calf is really presented as a powerful allegory. The big lesson from the author is a wake-up call to recognize that false idols are still around. Of course, they're not literal statues made of gold anymore. Today, they might be tyrannical rulers demanding our obedience, or maybe they're misleading scholars who twist religion to serve their own agendas. The book's final point is that the real test for a believer is to reject both of them and stick to the straight path, the path of divine guidance.
And so the author doesn't just wrap it up neatly. He leaves his readers with a really challenging question. If this ancient story is a timeless warning, and if the Pharaoh and the Samaritan really do exist in every age, then that leaves us with one big question to ask ourselves. What is the modern calf? What is that false idol in our world, today, that's demanding our loyalty and pulling us away from what's true?